Great, thank you very much. And you know, I think following that presentation, it's quite difficult to begin this discussion, which is about the MenB vaccine and then about the W vaccine, because as you heard, although JCVI recommended it a year ago, we don't yet have that vaccine in the programme, and I'll come to some of the reasons why that's been so difficult during the course of the talk. So I'm going to talk about both MenB and also the quadrivalent meningococcal vaccine, because both of those are live issues at the moment. So I thought that really the tack that I would take this morning was about whether we actually can control all of meningococcal disease that we have. And it's important to remember that, you know, MenB is one of the causes, the most common, but there are others as well. There's W and there's Y. Meningitis C, which is the type we've been vaccinating against since 1999, has almost completely disappeared. So we certainly can control at least that type. But what about these others? And that's what I'm going to cover today. And that really is divided into these three different areas. Do we want to? And it seems a strange thing to say after that last presentation. Then will the vaccines actually work that we have available? And lastly, which is the most important question, I guess, for this audience, is can we pay for it? So it seems absolutely clear that this disease is almost impossible for us to make a difference in compared with where we're up to at the moment. And what I mean by that is that when a child turns up in A&E with meningococcal disease, we throw all that we have at these cases in intensive care and so on, but we haven't really changed outcomes over the last decade. So although we've got much better at many of the technologies in the health system, we're not really having an impact on the outcomes over that period. Mortality stayed about the same over that period. The number of children with limb loss, as you heard, stayed about the same. And one of the problems for both parents and for those in primary care who first meet these children is that the disease looks so similar to many of the other minor viral infections that are encountered. So it's very difficult to recognise it earlier and stop it getting to these awful events happening. And also the speed of onset of the disease means that even if we did recognise it relatively early, it may be only a few more hours before the child is seriously ill or dies. And so, you know, for that reason, it's almost unthinkable that there's something we can now do that's going to reduce mortality even further or reduce the morbidity associated with the disease. Here you can see on I don't know where the pointer's gone. Is this a pointer? You can see on here that meningococcus is in green, and you can see that it has mortality and a morbidity that's a bit lower than some of the other bacterial pathogens which cause serious infections in children, but it still has a mortality between 5 and 10%. And although there are lots of media stories over the last few years about meningococcus, we're not really seeing the number of stories in the media that were apparent during the 1990s with meningitis C. And the reason for that is that currently most meningococcal disease is just sporadic cases where one individual is affected, it makes their local news story, but we don't hear very much about it nationally. National stories tend to be about where there's an outbreak, and one of the things that meningitis C did was it caused small outbreaks of 2 or 3 people, mostly in schools and universities, and that made big headlines because of the panic that then causes. And the sporadic cases are terrible tragedies for the individuals, but don't tend to raise that media awareness in the same way. And that was very important in driving the development and interest and implementation of the meningitis C vaccine in the 90s, which has been enormously successful, as I said. So I'm not going to dwell on whether or not we'd like to prevent this disease. I'm sure there's no one in the room who would like to see anyone else suffer from meningococcal disease. And so the answer to the first of the questions, I'm sure, is yes from everyone. We would like to prevent this disease. That's not difficult. So the second issue is whether the vaccines will work. So first of all, what vaccines do we have? There are 2 MenB vaccines that are now available. sorry, it's the next slide. The two MenB vaccines that are now available. There's one which is 4C MenB, which is licensed both here and in North America. And there's another vaccine which has just in the last year been licensed in the US as well. This one's not yet available in Europe, but I imagine it will be at some point in the future. I'm only going to talk about this vaccine because it's the one that's relevant for us in the UK at the moment. And it's a vaccine which is licensed for use from infancy. The difference with this one is the development has really been as a vaccine for teenagers, focused on the US market. So just to remind you that the meningococcus, which you can see here, comes in a number of different flavours. The meningitis C is we talked about earlier. Here we're talking about B, and I'll come to A, Y and W later. Now, the thing that makes them different is that they have a sugar coat, a polysaccharide capsule around the outside, and the different designations of A, B, C, Y and W just means that there's a different set of sugars on the outside of the bug. The meningitis C vaccine, which is shown here in red, was, at least the cases are shown here, it was hugely successful, and you can see up to 2012, almost all cases disappeared when that vaccine was introduced. We've been over the last couple of years just tweaking the program a little bit to make sure that we maintain immunity for across the whole population, and children and young adults stay protected, which is why the teenage booster came in. And we're confident that having done that, that this very low rate of disease will continue into the future. We know that that vaccine worked because of these three different features. First of all, in the people we vaccinated, the vaccine worked extremely well and protected them. For the younger children, that protection didn't last in the long run, which is why the boosters have to come in. But there is a short-term protection for everyone and much longer-term protection in the older age groups. It now turns out that perhaps the most important thing of all is herd immunity. By vaccinating teenagers and young adults who actually carry lots of the organism even when they're not ill, we prevent transmission to the rest of the population. So for those of us in the audience, and there's quite a lot of us who are too old to have been vaccinated back in '99, we're all still protected because teenagers have high levels of antibody as a result of that campaign in the 1990s, and then the booster that's now in the programme. So this is absolutely critical for maintaining population protection, and that's why the boosters are there in the programme. Now, MenB is different because that's the thing that was red on the other slide that's purple here, the sugar coat, is one which is identical to some sugars that we have in our brain during fetal development. And so our immune system sees that sugar as part of our cells. And so we don't make an immune response against it, and it's no use as a vaccine. So the vaccines for MenB have had to focus on various structures that are underneath the capsule, and these structures are proteins that are in the surface of the organism. The problem with that is, unlike the capsule, all B meningitis bugs have exactly the same capsule. Underneath the capsule, all bugs are a bit different. And this is just taking one of those proteins, POR-A, which is a very common protein that's been in many vaccines developed over the last 30 years. And this is just from 1 year in the UK, the number of different variants of that protein. So you can see that trying to make a B vaccine is actually quite difficult now. If you don't use the capsule, which is the same for all of them, you have to use something underneath the capsule, and you end up with very variable proteins. And that's true for almost any protein you look at, which is why it's such a challenge to make a vaccine that would prevent all cases. The one good thing is that most disease is caused by just a few proteins, and really the efforts are going to try and target the most common variants of proteins. The other approach that's been taken, and it's important just to give this as background because it's relevant to the vaccine which is licensed, is that as the meningococcus grows, it releases these blebs of its surface, its outer membrane, which you can see here being released from the surface. And using detergents, we can actually extract those from the bug in a manufacturing process and make these little spheres or vesicles of outer membrane of the organism to make a vaccine. And so we have a number of vaccines over the years which have been developed, made from this surface of the bug. And the problem that's been discovered with this approach, which does work, it's been used to control some epidemics, is it only really works against the strain that you've made it from. But it works extremely well against that strain. And of course we have lots of different strains in the UK. We don't have an outbreak of a single MenB strain, we've got lots of different ones. So these work extremely well, but although those vaccines have been available, controlled an epidemic in New Zealand that was there during the 1990s and early 2000s, it would only deal with a certain proportion of disease in the UK. So in fact, what has been done in developing this vaccine for MenB is to take the outer membrane vesicle from the New Zealand epidemic, and we think this could cover up to somewhere between 20% and a quarter of the disease in the UK, and then add some proteins from the surface which are slightly less variable than other proteins. And by adding these, the idea is that it would then extend protection against lots of different strains. And that's the vaccine which was first licensed in 2013. So if we now consider whether that vaccine would work, we need to look at these various different components, same as with MenC. Will the vaccine induce direct protection? How many strains would actually be covered? How long will the protection last? Will it induce memory responses so that your immune system remembers you've had a dose and it'll boost the next time you have it? And what about herd immunity? So very rapidly to think about some of those. Well, as I mentioned, because of that study, or at least the introduction in New Zealand for an epidemic, we already know that one component of the vaccine works. So this was the epidemic in New Zealand starting in 1990, peaking at the end of the 1990s, around 2000. And the epidemic was already waning at this point by the time the vaccine was made. And one of the important things to say here is that it takes a long time to make a new vaccine. So if you make your decision to vaccinate when an epidemic is happening, the epidemic has almost always started to wane by the time you introduce the vaccine, even though this is a 10-year timeline. And the vaccine was introduced here, and we know from the methodology used to assess whether the vaccine worked that somewhere between 70 to 80% efficacy of this vaccine, effectiveness of this vaccine in the program. So this vaccine works and has the type of impact that we would expect from a MenB vaccine against the strain which was causing the epidemic. We don't have effectiveness data for the other components because they've not been tested in an epidemic, and so far no country that's big enough has introduced the vaccine so that we can actually really assess how well the other components of the vaccine work against all of the strains that are circulating. So we end up having to use assays in the laboratory to provide the best estimate of whether these other components of the vaccine would work. And this is a study which was the first study in infants of this vaccine, which was undertaken here in Oxford in the mid-2000s. What I just want you to look at is the red bars, which is a year of age after the babies had had 4 doses of the vaccine. And you can see that the levels of antibody, and this is killing antibody, are nearly, mean that nearly 100% of the babies who were vaccinated had antibody levels that were able to kill the bugs that the vaccine is derived from. So in other words, if you take bugs which express the protein that's in the vaccine, they will be killed by the serum from babies who have been vaccinated. So the vaccine allows immunity against the bugs that the vaccine's made from. Now, if you take another bug, which is this one here, which has none of the proteins in it that are in the vaccine, not surprisingly, that bug can't be killed by antibodies from a baby. And so this tells us that because there are some bugs that are circulating that don't have the proteins that are in the vaccine, there will be some MenB that won't be covered by the vaccine. And so what we have from this is a hope that the vaccine will work and protect against some strains, but we know that there'll be some that it doesn't. So we have to now try and estimate how much coverage do you think we would get from the MenB vaccine. And there's been an enormous amount of work around Europe to try and estimate for the whole of Europe how well this vaccine might work and how many cases would be prevented. And I don't have time to go into the details of how that's actually done in the laboratory, but essentially the figures that have come up with a lot of work on this from Public Health England laboratories suggest that in England and Wales, somewhere between 70 and maybe even 90% of strains would be covered by the vaccine. A little bit higher in some other countries just because of the different strains circulating. So if this assessment in the laboratory is right, the vaccine should be able to prevent a vast majority of the strains that circulate, but not all of them. The newspapers obviously took this up, and this is their response to the development of this vaccine. And the question mark is there because until we've actually implemented the vaccine, we won't be absolutely sure whether our best predictions are right. So the second question is, what about herd immunity? We saw how important the impact of herd immunity was for the meningitis C vaccine. We know now that vaccinating teenagers prevented transmission of the bug in the population, and as a result of that, all the rest of us were protected. So what about for MenB? Well, for MenB, there was a study that was led by Rob Reed in Southampton in universities across the country, including both Brookes and Oxford University here. And in that study, 3,000 students were enrolled, and they got 2 doses of the vaccine. And then there was an estimate of how much of carriage of the MenB bug, which about 10% of us will be carrying, a slightly higher proportion amongst university students, how much that carriage was reduced after the 2 doses of vaccine had been given. And we end up with a figure that there is some impact against carriage of the vaccine, but it's probably less than 30%, and it's certainly greater than 0, but we're not absolutely sure what the number is. You can see here that they give a figure of 28% in the paper, but the confidence intervals cross 0, which means that we're extremely uncertain about whether that 28% figure is right. And but I think the analysis is fairly compelling that there is some impact against carriage. The difficulty with having so much uncertainty about that figure is that we don't, at this moment, know how much impact there actually is, and therefore whether it's likely to interrupt transmission and have a big herd immunity effect. And that becomes a very important uncertainty when we come to look at cost effectiveness. So the second question I posed was, will the vaccine work? Well, we already know that one component of the vaccine works. We have effectiveness data from an epidemic in New Zealand. And we have very good evidence of immunogenicity. There's studies now in all age groups showing that if you give children this vaccine, they will make an immune response against the components of the vaccine. So it's immunogenic. And the key question of how many of the strains that we have causing disease in the UK has been looked at in the laboratory, and we think that it could be as high as 88%, but there's some uncertainty over it because it's a laboratory assay and we haven't fully validated how that will perform in the field. And some impact on carriage in the studies, but we have uncertainty about how much. And as I say, that becomes important as we move on. I just want to very briefly touch on acceptability, and it may be that Jo wants to comment on this, because I know she's worked on this to some extent with some of the surveys that Public Health England have done. But we already know that there's extremely high acceptability of meningitis vaccines. There's surveys over probably several decades now showing that that's the case, that the public are very keen on these types of vaccines in this country. We do know that the MenB vaccine causes fever in infants. And this is a study from Finland showing that it may be as high as 40 or 50% of babies who get the MenB vaccine at the same time as they have their routine vaccines will get a fever. This is another study which is in teenagers, showing that if you give the vaccine to teenagers, they don't get a fever, but they do get a painful arm. So pain in older children and fever in infants, certainly up to about a year of age. Toddlers, it tends to be a painful vaccination. And Karen, you mentioned that your daughter had the vaccine painful? Yeah, painful. And that's a very widely reported symptom among those who have had the vaccine. So there is this question. We do know that if you give paracetamol, you can very much reduce the amount of fever. And we're doing a study at the moment funded by the European Commission to try and understand why the vaccine's so reactogenic. And that certainly is starting to look as if these figures for fever are correct. But interestingly, parents seem much less aware of the fever. It's relatively short-lived for most babies. And so even though they're told to look out for the fever, I think it's true to say, Matthew, that many parents don't even notice that there is a fever. But this is a really important question for when a vaccine like this is implemented, is how much will that fever actually be a problem for the delivery of vaccine programs? And it's something that will be looked at very closely and will need very careful communication. I know Joe is very much involved in that and may answer some questions on that later. So, will the vaccines work? Well, I think the answer is they certainly will work somewhat, and they might actually work quite a lot. And that brings to the last bit on MenB, is will the vaccine work? Now, the cost effectiveness is an important component of any new treatment that comes into the NHS. And although for those of us involved in vaccines, it's enormously frustrating that you have something which works to prevent an awful disease, and we'd just like to get on and implement it. The problem for the NHS is that the governments we elect give the NHS a defined budget, and they work out how they're going to spend that budget each year, and then into that budget they have to factor in any other new treatments that come, and there's obviously some contingencies for that. But essentially what it means is if you have another expensive program that you put in, whether it's vaccines or it's a new treatment for cancer, that has to be factored into that overall budget. And if it's a very expensive program, like an immunisation program, that will have to be balanced against whether you want to do more hip replacements that year or not. And in order to make that a fair assessment, there's a process which is done called cost effectiveness of vaccines, so cost effectiveness analysis, and that's done for all new things which have a pressure on the NHS budget. And I think to some extent, unfortunately, for those of us passionate about vaccines, is we do have to weigh vaccines against all other interventions that the NHS has. And that means that we have to put together a model to look at what the cost is of the vaccine, how many cases are prevented, how much of those cases cost. We've heard about from Karen the costs of managing from a hospital perspective all of the difficult orthopaedic problems that her daughter has suffered. So all of those go into that model to work out how expensive the disease is and balance that against the costs of buying the vaccine and delivering the program, and to weigh that up against all of the other health interventions. Not surprisingly, there are some very important drivers of cost effectiveness to decide how much is it worth having this new vaccine. The price for dose, for each dose, is very important in determining whether or not things are affordable. And if you have a vaccine that requires a lot of doses, it's clearly less affordable than one that doesn't need very many doses. And for the MenB program, the recommendation in infancy is that it would be given as a 3-dose schedule at 2, 4 and 12 months. So that's 3 doses. So the price per dose is important. The disease incidence, if you've got an extremely common disease and you prevent a lot of cases, then that's going to make it more cost effective than a rare disease. MenB obviously is a relatively rare disease. The strain coverage I've touched on, if you can't cover all of the strains, then it'll be less cost effective than if you can cover all of them. The quality of life losses I've touched on. The duration of protection becomes extremely important in some age groups, and I'll show you a little bit on that in a moment. If you can induce herd immunity, and by vaccinating one person you can prevent lots of other cases in other people, that makes it much more cost effective. So if you have certainty over some of these other aspects, it can help. And I'm not going to talk about discounting today, but if anyone wants to get into the economic model in detail, we can. So, disease incidence. The problem with meningococcal disease is the incidence changes quite a lot over time. This is going back to 1912. You can see during the two war times, First and Second World War, there were a lot of additional cases, probably as a result of troop movements over that period of time. And then we had this big increase in disease in the 1990s, which was partly meningitis C, but also an increase in B cases, and we've had a decline in cases overall since then. So what is the right number to put into the model about how many cases there are? And what was decided was to take a 7-year average of cases and say that's the average number of cases we might expect. And we're actually at a very low number at the moment. There were only 400 cases last year. So if you just took last year's figure, you would have a much less cost-effective vaccine than if you take an average. And of course, if you're trying to prevent disease and make it as effective for the NHS as possible, what we really need to know is how many cases we're going to have in the next 10 years. And I don't know the answer to that. So here you can see just that increase in cases that happened during the 1990s. And if we were talking at this point today, it would be very easy to make a case for a MenB vaccine. We'd have a lot of panic, lots of cases, an increasing number of MenB cases, and I don't think there would be any question that the Department of Health would do all they could to find a way of getting a vaccine implemented. But when we're down at a very low rate of disease, as we are at the moment, and uncertainty about what's happening in the future, it's much more difficult. I mentioned duration of protection, and this isn't terribly important actually for infants. This is the incidence of disease in different years, in different age groups. And what you see here is there are lots of cases in babies. So that's in the first year of life. So you only really need to have a vaccine which protects you for a year to prevent a lot of cases in infancy. So how long the vaccine works isn't very important if you're an infant, because you can still, even with 1 year's effectiveness, you prevent lots of cases. But if you take the purple line or the blue line, which is right down here, well, really in each year for teenagers there aren't that many cases. So if you have a vaccine that only provides protection for 1 year, you won't capture very many cases. So it becomes much more important in teenagers and older adults that the vaccine gives you protection for a long period of time in order for it to be more protective. Unfortunately, for most vaccines, that is exactly the case, that they tend not to persist very long in babies, which is why we end up giving lots of booster doses, and they persist much better in adolescents, which is why we have fewer boosters in adolescents. And that is the case, and I haven't got time to show you the data. So the group who are, as I said, the particular problem, who carry the bug, are teenagers. And this is a feature of all meningococci, that they live in our throats most of the time without causing any problem. And it's only in very rare cases that they get into the bloodstream and cause the awful effects that you heard of from Karen. And the carriage peaks in the late teens and early 20s. And so the reason why targeting that age group with a meningitis C vaccine is so important is if you get rid of all of this, then there's very little chance for it to spread to the rest of the population. And that, we believe, will be the same for MenB if we could get very high levels of antibody in this age group. But we have this uncertainty about whether the vaccine really does impact on carriage. And so some further work is needed for that. And we have asked the Department of Health to fund a national study to really address this issue and find out whether it is that number or it's something terribly low or perhaps even higher. So the cost effectiveness models for a MenB vaccine have been published. They were led by the University of Bristol with Public Health England. And essentially what this does is it works out how much we could pay for 1 dose of vaccine and it be cost effective in that NHS model. And depending on lots of different possibilities, the strain coverage, how many doses you give, you end up with a cost for each dose of vaccine of somewhere between £1 and £5. And this is at the best estimate. And that's a model which is relatively favourable. It puts a reasonably high number of cases, higher than we have at the moment. And even if you assume quite a high strain coverage, So all of those facts we've talked about are relatively favourable, but you still end up with a relatively low price for each dose of the vaccine in this model. Now the problem with that is we've got lots of uncertainty. So it could be that if you adjust these numbers and you choose figures which look more like they were at the peak of disease in 1999, you could end up with a figure that was 3 or 4 times higher. And so we don't know what the right figure is, but that's where the models have come out. Now you will, I'm sure, know from the media reporting that JCVI actually came up with what's been described as 3 different models. This one, and this one. So what I should just tell you that what this graph is what is the cost-effective vaccine price for the vaccine. Now the first model here, which was done I think now about 4 years ago, perhaps 5 years ago, was with the first parameters that Public Health England could put together from the epidemiology, and the thought was the vaccine would be cost-effective at about £8 a dose. There was then a lot of work done to try and say, well, have we really got the best estimates for all of these different parameters that have to go into the cost effectiveness? And the next model that was done, which was published in July, nearly 2 years ago now, essentially came up with a figure of £0 per dose. And so it wasn't cost effective in that. But what the committee did at that point was said, we have so much uncertainty, we're going to put this model out for public consultation and or stakeholder consultation and have some feedback. And that feedback resulted in a lot of new information and in fact some new studies which weren't available. And the model was then revised in light of that and came out as this roughly £5 per dose, which I've just mentioned. So I think the answer is that with the UK model that's being used, the model itself hasn't changed, it's just your decisions on how much strain coverage and how many cases and so on, varies somewhere at a very low price for the vaccine. Now in Chile they also worked out a model and they came up with a price of about £11 a dose. And the Netherlands, they came up with a model which gave a price, I can't remember what that is now, it's about £7 a dose. So what this tells us is that a MenB vaccine, because it's a rare disease, is always going to be not particularly cost effective as a program. It's very difficult when you're at an individual level for families and you want to prevent this awful disease. But the way the NHS looks at it, which is driven by Treasury rules, this is not very cost effective. And so the only way that you can introduce a vaccine under these circumstances is through negotiation with the manufacturer to try and find a price which is somewhere in the range of uncertainty that fits with this. And that's what's been going on for the last year. So that's the answer to the question. It's sort of out of our hands. It's Department of Health negotiating with the manufacturer for something which, unfortunately, for a terrible disease, in the way that as a society we've decided we should measure the budget for the NHS, is not very cost effective. Now, and you can see, if you look at the list price in the BNF for the vaccine, you can see how far away we are from, on the private market, what the list price is, which you can see here. And of course that's the sort of price, or even more than that many parents who have decided to buy the vaccine are paying. I think in Oxford people are buying it for about £100 a dose. So essentially the cost effectiveness analysis shows that the vaccine is a little bit borderline. It is recommended by JCVI to be incorporated if the Department of Health can negotiate a price. And we'll know, if the vaccine is implemented, we'll know a lot more about all of these different issues, about how well those laboratory assays really did predict how well it would work. So I think on MenB, I think we all want the vaccine. The vaccines almost certainly will work. We have some uncertainty about how much. And really the data we have favours introducing a vaccine, and we have to wait for these ongoing discussions. Okay, so just to finish off the last bit about W, so this is where we were in the middle of last year, where we were aware that there had been some increase in meningococcal disease caused by capsular group W, and we were seeing just the start in October of last year of a big increase compared with the year before. It was difficult to know at that point how to interpret it. but just recognising that, that this change was happening. We started to suspect that we might be at the beginning of a problem with W. And so at JCVI we recommended that the adolescent dose was switched, of MenC was switched to the quadrivalent vaccine, which would cover W as well. But we also asked Public Health England to keep us updated about what was happening with the epidemiology of this W and what was happening. Now, it turns out that the W strain which had come is a new strain. It's a strain which had arrived from Latin America. And you can see here that in countries such as Argentina and Chile, there had been an increase in W cases during the 2000s. And there's a couple of highlights here. One is obviously enormous doubling of cases over a couple of years, which caused a lot of alarm in Chile and Argentina. But also this very high case fatality rate. A third of the people affected died. And that really is going back to what meningococcal disease was like in the early 1990s here in the UK, before we had paediatric intensive care and so on. So this is pretty unusual for our setting to see such high case fatality. And it was a new strain of meningitis W which hadn't been seen before, and I don't have time to go into where that comes from. So in fact now when we come to the February JCVI meeting, these are the data that you saw from Joe at the beginning of the day, with this very sharp increase in cases. And we now have reached, in the last 12 months, 117 cases of W. And you go back here to the end of the first bit of the 2000s, 2009, there were only 22 cases. So that is now almost 5 times as many cases as there were just a few years ago. And this looks exactly like the beginning of the big increase in meningitis C in the 90s, where a new clone appeared, and over a few years the number of cases doubled, and eventually by 1999 there were 1,000 cases a year of meningitis C. So if this strain was increasing at that same rate, and we could predict the future and that happened, we would be in a desperate situation over the next decade. Now, the thing about this is, in the early 90s, when this early change was recognised, there was no meningitis C vaccine. And it took most of the 90s to develop that vaccine, eventually deploy it in 99, when there was already 1,000 cases a year. And the difference this time is that we're recognising this right at the beginning of a new clone arriving, causing lots of disease, and we already have a vaccine. So in February, recognising the sharp rise, what JCVI said is they recognise it as an aggressive strain. I haven't got the case fatality data on a slide here, but in fact already in the UK it's almost 3 times the case fatality of the rest of meningococcal disease. It's about 13% at the moment, which probably the difference between here and South America relates just to our healthcare system. So it is clearly more aggressive than the rest of the meningococcal strains we have. And because we have a vaccine. So the question was, who should we vaccinate? Well, if you look at what happened in Latin America, they decided to vaccinate the group which had a high rate, which was young children. And you can see here that after they introduced the vaccine, the numbers of cases dropped dramatically in that group who were vaccinated. Not surprisingly, the vaccine works. But what you also notice from here is that in those other age groups who weren't vaccinated, the numbers of cases continued to rise or have stayed extremely high. And that tells you that in this age group, if you vaccinate them, you'll protect them, but you don't protect anyone else. And as I said earlier today, that for meningococcal vaccines, you really need to be targeting this age group in here in order to then provide protection to the rest of the population. And so the plans for the introduction of the programme here for the UK will be to immunise 14 to 18-year-olds in the expectation that they will be protected, but it will also, over a couple of years, introduce herd immunity and prevent disease in all the other age groups. So I'm going to go quickly past that. So this was announced on Friday. That's the target group. And currently the Department of Health and NHS England are working together to work out the logistics of how that will actually be delivered, and I'm sure you'll all be hearing more about that sooner than you'd like. This was what appeared in the newspapers. So that was the acknowledgement slide I would have had at the end. I'm going to stop there, and we're now going to move to the panel.